to today's national call, our National HoUSed campaign call. We're going to give folks a couple minutes to join online, and then we'll get started right away. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining our National HoUSed campaign call. We're going to give folks one more minute to join on, and then we'll get started. Okay, everybody. Hi, welcome to today's National HoUSed call. I am Sarah Sadie, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. It's so great to be with all of you guys today. Just as a quick reminder, these calls are part of our campaign, which is focused on achieving the large-scale investments and reforms that are needed to ensure that the lowest income people have an affordable place to call home. We launched this campaign because we recognize that more than ever, we need really bold policy solutions at the federal level to ensure that people with the lowest incomes and those who are most marginalized have a stable, affordable, accessible home. And on our call today, we have advocates from across the country, including homeless service and shelter providers, housing providers, resident organizers, people with lived experience, including those who are receiving or are in need of federal assistance for housing. We have philanthropy and media on the call. It's a really broad audience who's with us today. Before we jump into the agenda, I just want to remind folks that you can ask your questions in the Q&A box. That's a little easier for us to follow than into the chat box, so just keep that in mind. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can, but we might not have time to get to every question. And then also, just as a quick reminder that after today's webinar, we're going to share a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and all of the materials that our speakers might mention. We'll share that with you in the coming days so that you can have access to them. We're going to go ahead and get started with our first speaker, Jennifer Sullivan, who is the Director of Healthcare Coverage Access at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a strong partner of ours at NLHC, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about Medicaid unwinding this afternoon. Let's see, next slide. And should I be advancing these? No. Okay. All right. Here we go. So the reason that I chose this tidal wave image on this slide, and if you take nothing else away from my remarks this afternoon, please understand that there is a big change coming in Medicaid that will affect lots and lots and lots of the people that we all care about. 10 years ago, we were working towards getting millions of people connected to coverage for the first time when the Affordable Care Act was going live and healthcare.gov was going through all of its growing pains. And now, 10 years later, we are on the precipice of a sort of reverse situation where we could have a major contraction in the number of people who are connected to Medicaid or other forms of affordable health coverage. So this is an absolutely pivotal moment. Why? For the last 3 years, as part of legislation to keep people connected to health coverage through the pandemic, Medicaid in every state was not allowed, as a condition of receiving extra money, which every state did, states were not allowed to terminate people's Medicaid coverage, no matter what changed about their situation. Continuous coverage, people kept their health insurance come what may. But as a provision of legislation that was passed as part of the budget resolution at the end of last year, that period of time is coming to an end. It was previously linked to the public health emergency. It no longer is. But what's important for you to know is that people could be receiving notices from their Medicaid agency right now in the month of February, with the potential that their coverage could end as soon as April 1st. States are allowed to start terminating people in April and have to go through their entire caseload. Every single person who is enrolled in Medicaid, the state has to check their information, renew their eligibility, or send them someplace else if they are no longer eligible for Medicaid. This is a massive undertaking. We've never seen anything like it in Medicaid. And so anybody that is living in the Medicaid space is really sort of rattling the cages about why this is a really big deal and something that we need all partners and all hands on deck to get the word out about. Next slide. So we call this unwinding. You might hear people talk about unwinding, and it just refers to this phenomenon of needing to get everybody in Medicaid renewed or moved to a different form of coverage if they don't qualify for Medicaid anymore. It's massive. There's over 18 million people anticipated to lose coverage, not because they are all no longer eligible, but because the process of proving your eligibility and keeping coverage is going to be very challenging for many people. So what we want to talk about today is how you can help reduce that challenge so that more people keep coverage. Next slide. So I sort of mentioned this a couple of slides ago, but the timing really is that starting right now, starting February 1st, depending on how states are approaching this, they may be starting to send notices in the mail. So that's paper mail that tells a person, this is the information that we have about your case, and if any of it is incorrect, then you need to let us know. Or it might say, we don't have any information about your current case, and if you don't respond to us and tell us what's going on, then you're going to lose your coverage. And that could happen again as soon as April 1st, but states have over the next year to actually get through their entire caseload, and there isn't a way for an individual to know when their notice is coming, which is why it's even a little bit more complicated. Because if somebody says, hey, wait, can I just take care of this proactively and know that my Medicaid is safe? Well, no, actually, you have to sort of wait until your state has decided it's your turn to provide your information and state coverage. So it's going to be really a whole year of being really alert and responding to notices. But we know, next slide, that not everybody the process is not going to work well for everybody. For many people, the process is going to be far from ideal. These are different buckets of coverage. So we know in the green bucket, fortunately, millions of people are still eligible, and the state will have enough information in its own databases to say, yep, you're eligible. Here you go. You have another year of coverage. You don't have to do anything else. But there are multiple other buckets where action is going to be needed. We'll have about 3.8 million people who aren't qualified for Medicaid anymore, and they will need to either transition to job-based coverage, or in the 2.6 million bucket next to it, might need to transition to the marketplace in their state, to healthcare.gov in many states. But then these last two red buckets, we're really concerned about. We've got about 6.8 million people who are still eligible for Medicaid, but either won't get a notice, or won't understand what to do with a notice, or don't have a mailing address, or have moved since January of 2020. Many people would fall in that bucket. And if they haven't updated their address with their state Medicaid agency, they might not get that notice. So how do we help those folks keep their coverage despite these greater barriers that they will face? And then unfortunately, in the remaining states that haven't expanded Medicaid, we still have close to 400,000 people who are estimated to no longer be eligible for Medicaid, but not be eligible for anything else because they're in what we call the Medicaid coverage gap. So just to give you a sense of the scope, next slide. Steps in the process. Believe it or not, this is a radically simplified map of the Medicaid renewal process. But generally what's going to happen is the state's going to use all its information to try and redetermine somebody, and they can't terminate somebody based on what they have. If they don't have enough to keep somebody enrolled, then they have to ask for more information and give somebody time to respond. If they respond, great, they can keep coverage. They usually have about 30 days to do that. If they don't respond on time, then they're going to be terminated. And the important thing, I think, for partners like you all to know in the community is if you come across somebody who has, or even if you yourself have been denied Medicaid, but you believe you are still eligible, you have 90 days to provide the agency with the information that they need to process your eligibility determination and keep you covered. And that would ensure that you don't have a gap in coverage, you keep Medicaid for the duration. If you miss that window, then you have to start all over again. And you can apply again, of course. There's no penalty to applying again for Medicaid if you've lost it for procedural reasons, but it's more time and it's more likely that you're going to have a period of time where you're uninsured, which we want to avoid for as many people as possible. And then if people are in fact terminated from Medicaid and they aren't eligible anymore, then we want to give them that smooth glide path to coverage in a state-based marketplace. Next slide. So why are people going to lose coverage? Again, they don't receive the notice. They don't understand the notice. They don't submit information on time. They submit information and the state agency is completely overwhelmed because they're going through this gargantuan process of renewing everybody. And like many public agencies and many employers right now, they are severely understaffed. Lots of reasons why even if somebody is actually eligible, they could lose coverage. So state partners are going to be incredibly important to helping people navigate this successfully. Next slide. A couple slides here just about who is most likely to lose coverage. I bet many of you, if I asked, you could come up with these groups pretty easily. It's unfortunately fairly intuitive, but the people that are going to face the greatest procedural barriers are the people who are most likely to lose coverage. So out of the children who will lose coverage or who are anticipated to lose coverage, 70%, more than 70% of them who lose coverage are still going to be eligible. Partially, this is a factor because Medicaid covers so many kids. But the fact is, we need to be and institutions and organizations and agencies that work with families with young children to make sure that they know what to do to keep their kids covered or to get them back in if they do in fact lose coverage. Next slide. And then when we look at this by race and ethnicity, we also see that, not surprisingly, the groups that are more likely to face administrative barriers to enrolling in Medicaid in the first place are also the groups that are more likely to lose coverage for procedural reasons during this renewal process. So 64% of Latinos who lose coverage are estimated to still be eligible, about half of AAPI individuals, and about 40% of Black non-Latino people who lose coverage will still be eligible. So we really have our work cut out for us to make sure that people with the greatest barriers can get through this process. Next slide. Okay, so what can we do about it? Robust outreach and communications. We need you all to understand what these simple messages are, update your information with your state Medicaid agency, respond to notices quickly. If you don't understand what's going on, there's free local help in your community who can help you, whether that's in person, whether that's on the phone, online. There are resources to help people get through this process and the way that they prefer. Next slide. I don't want to run out of time. So a couple more reminders on what you can do. In addition to encouraging people to update their information, look for notices in the mail. If people are terminated, but we think they're still eligible, then they can reapply. Just do that quickly so you don't have a gap in coverage where you have an unpaid medical bill that you have to contend with. Partner with local navigators and other enrollment assisters. In states that use healthcare.gov, there are navigators that provide free help to anybody who needs it to enroll in coverage. This is not just in marketplace coverage. They can help people with Medicaid issues as well. And they're absolutely primed and ready and know that this is coming. So if you know where to refer somebody in your community, that's perhaps the most powerful step that you can take. And then finally, feedback loops. The process will be bumpy no matter what, but it's hard to anticipate exactly where the bumps are going to come up. But it's important that state Medicaid agencies and federal policymakers and regulators understand what's going on the ground so they can do the quick course correction to make sure that if there are things we can do to make this better for people, that we're doing those in real time. So if you're seeing something happening with the people that you serve and the community you serve, connecting with the enrollment or Medicaid coalition in your state is going to be really critical so that we get that on the ground feedback loop going and can correct things quickly. Next slide. The last slide here is just some resources for you all, including a tailored frequently asked questions for housing and homelessness services providers, to tell you more about what's going on here or to help you inform any colleagues or partners about what's going on. You've got the link to that document there, as well as an excellent piece from the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council on unwinding that's linked here as well. So you'll be able to access all of those links in the slides from today's presentation. So with that, I will pause if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Jenny. This is really scary. And I'm just going to point out a comment from Jerry Poho in the chat box talking about how critical this issue is, especially the harm that this could do. So I'm so glad that you're able to join with us and share with folks about what steps they can take to protect themselves and others in their community. And just to ask a finer point on that, the links that you have here for navigators, is that the best place people should be referring individuals to when they're facing trouble with complying with or responding to their notices?
Absolutely. There are two places to go. GetCoveredAmerica.org houses a tool from an organization called Young Invincibles. They have a tool where you can schedule an appointment with an assister in a number of states. They cover most states with at least information about how to contact a navigator, and then some states there's scheduling information. Or you can go to localhelp.healthcare.gov. The important thing there is to go to the filters, and this is why I always put this as the second option. You need to go to the filters after you enter your zip code and select only assisters, not agents and brokers. Health insurance agents and brokers are not experts in Medicaid, and we don't want to be sending people to those individuals to get assistance in this situation. And so that's just a really important thing. Make sure you're sending people to a navigator or to an assister based at like a community health center.
Perfect. That's really helpful for folks to know. And this applies to, we have a question from Jerry. This applies to everybody who is receiving Medicare, Medicaid. Does that include tenants who are living in affordable assisted living facilities?
It does. It includes everybody who's getting any kind of Medicaid services, whether that's through a child and adult category, through home and community-based services, et cetera. And I think one thing I didn't mention, but it's an important message, I think, to potentially convey to some of the folks that you all serve and are in community with, is that Medicaid benefits are not intrinsically tied to housing benefits. So just because one benefit is going away doesn't mean other benefits are going away. Like we want people to take action, but we don't want to scare them needlessly. Other benefits have their own schedules and have their own rules, and this doesn't affect that. We just want to make sure that they can keep Medicaid if that's where they belong.
Wonderful. Another question we got from David Blatt was about asking you to dig in a little bit more about why there are so great of racial disparities in terms of who is going to lose access as this unwinds. Do you have any more information about why those households are most at risk?
Yeah, sure. I can, once I'm done here, I will put another link in the chat. We actually wrote a paper it was last year, on administrative barriers to Medicaid. And unfortunately, people of color are more likely to face greater administrative barriers, both enrolling in and keeping Medicaid. That has to do with the ability to provide information on time, to have an address where they can receive notices in a reliable way, to have an easy time documenting income and household information. Certainly for folks who, for people who are not citizens, there are greater barriers to proving what you can and can't receive that keep a lot of eligible people out. So I will send that paper that has a lot of more specific examples from states so that you understand what those barriers are about.
Wonderful. And you mentioned that people need to have mailing addresses in order to receive the notice from their state agency. Can you speak a little bit about what that means for people who are experiencing homelessness?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, and I wish my colleagues from the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council were here. You don't have to have a permanent place of residence or a place where you receive mail to get Medicaid. So it's not an eligibility criteria, but you do have to enter an address on the application. And so that could be a friend or a relative's address. That could be a PO box. That could be a shelter or another community services agency, but there has to be an address there. Whatever address somebody entered when they originally enrolled may not be where they are today. So people who are serving folks who have Medicaid just need to work with them to reach out to the Medicaid agency and provide an updated place where they can get those notices, because they will have to take action at some point, most likely.
Well, I really want to thank you for joining with us. To everybody who's on the call, we're going to share a copy of this PowerPoint and all of the great links that Jenny has provided so that you can help make sure that your access is protected and you can work in your community to make sure other people are able to maintain their Medicaid coverage as well. There are some other questions in the Q&A box that we weren't able to get to, Jenny, but if you're able to stay on and answer them, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for giving me some time today. And thank you all for thinking about this important issue.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We're going to move now, to Jerry Jones, who's the National Field Director for the National Alliance to End Homelessness, who's going to talk a little bit about responding to challenges in the field where we're seeing an increase in criminalization of homelessness. Jerry.
Thank you, Sarah. It's good to be with all of you. So I was going to spend a few minutes talking about criminalization, as well as a statement of values that the National Alliance End Homelessness has developed. We'll put that link in the chat, and we'd appreciate your support for that statement of values. I wanted to give an overview of what has become a very well-resourced, coordinated effort to expand criminalization laws across the country in a growing number of states. And maybe to begin by drawing a distinction between criminalization ordinances as we've known them before. There's, really going back as long as we've had, we've been in this era of mass homelessness in this country since the 1980s. There have been anti-panhandling laws and sit-lie laws and camping bans and so forth. We're in a different political moment, and many of you on this call are already tracking this. But I want to emphasize that difference, that for decades, cities and states have kind of cycled between punitive sort of law enforcement driven approaches to homelessness, and then those same cities or states very often a few years later kind of pivot to more program-based, positive recognition that it's really housing and services that makes a difference on this issue. But then very often those same cities, if you check with them a few years later, they've sort of drifted back to criminalization because the housing programs weren't having an impact fast enough, and so we've seen this sort of pendulum swing back and forth for years and decades on this issue. What has changed is the it's the issue of homelessness generally, and the embrace of criminalization policies has become much more political. And so what I wanted to do in just the next few minutes is talk about why that is, sort of where this is coming from, what the origins of this new this new dynamic with criminalization. What exactly is happening? What are these policies and the state of play? And then finally, what are we doing about it? So I would trace the real origin for the political moment we're in now to the summer of 2019. There was an interview that Tucker Carlson of Fox News was having with then President Trump. And it was mostly a foreign policy interview. There had been a summit with Chinese leadership, and so most of the questions in that interview were about foreign policy topics. And then toward the end of that interview, Carlson asked, he made the comment that the Japanese city where they were doing the interview didn't have as much street homelessness as Los Angeles or San Francisco. And the former president kind of went on a rant about unsheltered homelessness. So I think that's sort of required viewing. I promise it's a short clip, but if we go to the next slide, this is less than a minute, just to listen to the president's remarks in July of 2019. We may not have the audio. Can others hear that? Can someone in the chat?
No, we can't. I can't hear that. I think May is going to work to try to
Okay.
see if she
I'll
can
summarize it just in the interest of time. And this is online if you search for.
You know, I had a situation when I first became president. We had certain areas of Washington, D.C. where that was starting to happen. And I ended it very quickly. I said, you can't do that. When we have leaders of the world coming in to see the president of the United States and they're riding down a highway, they can't be looking at that. I really believe that it hurts our country. They can't be looking at scenes like you see in Los Angeles and San Francisco. San Francisco, I own property in San Francisco, so I don't care, except it was so beautiful. And now areas that you used to think as being, you know, really something very special, you take a look at what's going on with San Francisco, it's terrible. So we're looking at it very seriously. We may intercede. We may do something to get that whole thing cleaned up. It's inappropriate. Now, we have to take the people and do something. It's destroying a whole way of life. And it's not our country. It's not what our country is all about.
So within a few months of that clip, and it's unclear whether the president, just sort of made an unplanned comment or whether this was a more intentional policy shift. But within a few months of that interview, following some tweets and other sort of announcements on the issue of homelessness, there was a team of White House officials who went out to Los Angeles to engage the city leaders there about clearing out Skid Row and relocating. As some of you know, Skid Row is the largest homeless encampment in the United States. About 4,000 people experiencing homelessness in this fairly small area of downtown Los Angeles, using federal land outside of the city of LA and less populated parts of LA County. Mayor Garcetti was in office at that time. There was engagement. I mean, obviously that would have been unconstitutional and infeasible, but there was a back and forth with the White House about what could be done. You know, what if this was something the president was concerned about? Could there be more resources that LA could access? And so there was a serious back and forth there. And it was around that same time that Robert Marbut replaced the previous US ICH director, and changes at the federal level on homelessness policy began with that personnel shift. The pandemic, as we all know, shortly followed, and then the president lost his reelection. But this issue of talking about homelessness this way has had a profound impact in state and local politics. And to have the president, it's very impactful when the president singles out an issue in the way that he did with that initial interview. In former President Trump's first public remarks after losing the election and coming back to Washington for a policy address, he essentially reiterated the proposal that had been made in 2019 and 20 in Los Angeles, that what he felt was needed is to remove the hundreds of thousands of people, and he said there might be even more, to inexpensive lands outside cities and create camps, these high quality tents that he's talking about. Next slide, please. And just last week, this was Monday a week ago, the Trump campaign outlined in a policy brief the same basic concept, that we need to take our streets back from the homeless, the drug addicted, and the mentally ill. So having worked on this issue for a while, I can tell you there's really never been, from the standpoint of the president and the White House making these kinds of suggestions about what to do about homelessness, it has energized his supporters to then try to implement this very agenda. And so that's a lot of what's going on now. And it's, as I said earlier, it's a different kind of criminalization than we've seen before. Next slide, please. What I think most of us have heard about or beginning to hear about is a group in Texas called the Cicero Institute, which is a conservative think tank that is moving this type of legislation. I'll point out that the things that the Cicero Institute are suggesting are very much the same things former President Trump was talking about, making it illegal for people to be out of doors in public space, creating designated places for them to be alternatively, and coercing them into either camps or temporary shelter. And then there's been some legislative mechanisms in these bills that the Cicero Institute has championed around forcing jurisdictions that might not agree with this course of action to go along, or else they'll lose money. And a lot of this is also connected to a general view that we should stop spending money on permanent housing. There's a lot of anti-housing first rhetoric tied in with all of this, and that the money should instead be shifted to the sanctioned camps or temporary measures. Next slide, please. There's now a half dozen states where this has either become the law or is in motion. Texas was the first in 2021. Many people will remember last year, Tennessee made unauthorized camping a felony, a Class E felony. The Cicero Institute, I think, inspired that, but they weren't as involved in Tennessee last summer. But now they've introduced legislation this session to build those other components that were in the previous slide, to expand the federal penalty to include some of those other policy, the components of criminalization from the other bills. Missouri passed the law last year as well, and we have some serious fights on our hands. Arizona, Georgia. I was just on a call earlier today with Kansas, where it's the same template model language that the Cicero Institute has passed in some of these other states have been introduced in the states where they're now considering the legislation. This is not restricted to MAGA Republicans by any measure. And I want to be clear about this. This basic truth is that most of the people experiencing homelessness who are being criminalized and who are having their lives interrupted by law enforcement simply for existing in public space, most of the people experiencing criminalization are doing so in democratic jurisdictions because disproportionately the populations are in those larger areas. And so Los Angeles has a sit-lie law that they've expanded. New York City, you don't see a lot of unsheltered homelessness in New York City because folks are very quickly engaged by law enforcement. And I do think it's important, though, that this basic strategy that Cicero has laid out of making it illegal for people to be anywhere other than designated camps is metastasizing to places that I think by most accounts would be seen as pretty progressive. So in the next slide, you'll see the mayor of Portland, Oregon, explaining why his city now needs, in the next slide, why Portland needs sanctioned camps, because they've already outlawed everywhere else that folks might be. He said, I've already banned it on routes to school, other corridors, and they're concerned now that people might rightly ask, well, if folks aren't allowed to be anywhere, where would they go? And so the city of Portland has already adopted a citywide camping ban that will then create sanctioned camps for folks to move along. So let me finish simply by going to the next slide and encouraging everyone to take a look at the Alliance's Statement of Principles Against the Criminalization of Homelessness. This is on our website, and we will put the link in the chat. again. And we would ask everyone on this call to sign up for that so that we can know that you're interested in this issue, and we'll stay in touch with you on next steps on how we're fighting these bills. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jerry. And I just want folks to know that the National Income Housing Coalition has signed on to this statement of principles. We would really love to encourage all of you to do so as well. This is a threat, as Jerry mentioned, that's happening all across the country, not just in red states, but in blue cities too, and everywhere in between. And it's something that I think all of us are increasingly worried about. I wanted to just check with Jerry. I don't see a ton of questions coming in, but a lot of people who are similarly outraged by how gross it is for elected officials to be moving people out of public sight instead of focusing on real solutions. So I'm wondering if you could just say a word more about what people should be telling their local elected officials about the right way to address homelessness.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah, I don't think there is a lot of questions on the content. It's pretty self-evident just how punitive and mean-spirited this stuff is. So what's been effective in the states that have pushed back on Cicero legislation is emphasizing the better alternatives, that housing and services are the answer to unsheltered homelessness. Having permanent places for people to come inside is far better than having law enforcement simply force someone from one corner to the next. And to point out that, unless there's a housing oriented approach, these camps or temporary shelters that Cicero is proposing are going to fill up pretty quickly. If there's no flow, then whatever capacity is there will be taken up, and it's not a solution to the underlying problem of people being homeless.
Absolutely. And I also noticed my colleague Elena put a link to a series that the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and the Center on Budget Policy Priorities has been hosting on homelessness and housing first. It's a really great series. We're hearing from people with lived experience, practitioners, experts about this Cicero threat, and giving folks much more in detail the tools that they need to push back on that. So just a plug for that webinar series. Hope you guys can check that out. And Jerry, thank you so much for joining. I hope lots of folks sign on to your statement of principles.
Thank you.
Absolutely. We're going to move on now to Andrew HoUSed. I think I'm pronouncing that wrong. So Andrew, let me know. He's the Director of Household and Public Policy Research with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Andrew?
Hi there. Thank you, Sarah. That was pretty good. I pronounced my last name Howitt, but that was really good for a first try. So thanks very much for inviting me to be here today. I'm going to talk about some work that we've done at the New York Fed's research group on eviction expectations, and I'll give a little bit of background en route to that discussion. So if we could go to the next slide, please. This is based on work that I have done with several different colleagues over the last couple of years on eviction, who gets evicted, what implications does eviction have, and who's expecting to be evicted in the future. Everything I say today will be my own views, and that will not reflect necessarily views of the New York Fed or the Federal Reserve System. So let's go to the next slide, please. So at the New York Fed, we actually do quite a lot of research on housing. We do a lot of work on homeownership and how people transition into and out of homeownership, how transitions into and out of homeownership differ for different kinds of people. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that. It's an important issue for a lot of reasons, as you're all aware. We're very concerned about the mortgage market and how mortgages are performing, whether people are falling behind on their mortgage payments, whether they're getting underwater on their mortgages, whether people have access to mortgage credit that allows them to enter home ownership, and what are the barriers to access to mortgage credit. So all of these are really important questions that we spend a lot of time on. We also think a lot about house prices and how house prices go up and down over the business cycle and over the real estate cycle, how that affects housing wealth. So there's a lot of sort of macro kinds of questions that have to do a lot with it transitions into and out of homeownership and how those who own homes are faring as the economy evolves. Today, I'm going to talk about something that's closely related, but is a little bit different from all that. I'm going to talk about a special survey that we run at the New York Fed. It's called the Survey of Consumer Expectations Housing Survey. Now, this is a survey that we put in the field every month, the Survey of Consumer Expectations, and we ask a representative sample of households a lot of different kinds of questions about their experiences in the economy and what they're expecting in the future. So, for example, an important set of questions we ask households is, what do you think inflation is going to be in the future? What do you think your wages are going to be in the future? What do you think the chances are that you will be able to get a new job in the future? So we're very focused on how people are thinking their personal experiences of the economy are going to evolve. And by asking this set of questions on a monthly frequency, we can see how people's feelings about the economy are changing. So as you can see, it's a very forward-looking survey that has a lot of information about what people are thinking. Now, every February, including right now, it's in the field right now for 2023, we ask a special set of questions about housing. And again, it's a forward-looking survey. So we ask questions like, what do you think your probability of buying a home is over the next year or over the next 3 years? If you're a renter, what's the probability that you will ever own a home over the course of your lifetime? We ask questions like, what do you think mortgage rates are going to be doing over the next year? And how do you feel like how do you feel mortgage conditions are today, and how will they change? So it's a unique opportunity in the SCE, the Survey of Consumer Expectations Housing Survey, to ask a representative group about something that very rarely gets talked about in big national surveys, in this case, evictions. So we were interested in getting from a representative sample of households what their experience with evictions is and what they expect those experiences, and how do they expect things to happen in the future with respect to their own experience with evictions. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to present some results from various waves of the about evictions in 3 separate years, 2019, 2020, and 2022. We didn't ask questions in 2021 for a variety of reasons, which we can come back to if people are interested in talking about that. So let me start out with a sort of set of basic facts about eviction experiences. The first thing that you should know is that we asked 2 kinds of questions of people in the survey. We asked them questions about their own experience with evictions. Have they ever themselves been evicted from a home that they were renting? And then secondly, we asked them if they've known any individuals or families who've been evicted since 2006. And we've been asking, as I say, these questions since 2019. And we asked them not just about their own experience with eviction, but as I'll show you in a few minutes, we asked them questions about what they expect to happen in the future. So now on this slide, you can see that I'm sorry, previous slide still. We've combined the samples from all 3 of those survey years, so we can get fairly big samples for asking questions like, what is your current income and what is your experience with eviction? So on the left-hand panel, you can see we ask people if you've ever been evicted, people who have ever been evicted themselves, what is their income today? So these are people who are looking back over the history of their homeownership, or I'm sorry, their renting experience, telling us whether they've ever been evicted, and then we compare that to their income today. And you can see that, perhaps not surprisingly, experience with eviction personally is very concentrated among households with relatively low incomes, household incomes below 30,000, especially. You can see those 3 big bars on the left. personal experience with eviction is very rare among people who are currently earning pretty high incomes in the neighborhood of $60,000 or higher. On the right-hand side, you can see, though, that for households who know someone who's been evicted since 2006, that's much more evenly spread across the income distribution. So even though experience oneself with eviction is concentrated among relatively low-income households, there's a experience of people knowing people who've been evicted is actually quite common across the income distribution. So now let's go to the next slide. This is a result that I think is very interesting from our 2020 survey. And it shows what people report as the reason they were evicted. One of the benefits of a survey like ours is that we're asking people what their experience with eviction is outside of the court system. So a lot of the research on evictions is focused on court cases that involve evictions, but there are, as it turns out, many evictions that don't ever happen in the courtroom. They just sort of happen outside of the legal process. And you can see a little bit of evidence for that here. So in the blue of this pie chart are people who said they were evicted because they had an income or a job loss. And you can see that's a very substantial share of people who report having been evicted themselves, about half. But what's amazing to me is that about half of the people don't report an income or job loss as being underlying their eviction. Rather, it's something like a change in building ownership, or the apartment was being remodeled, or something along those lines. Things that you could think of as nothing to do with the person themselves, but having sort of bad luck for the person who got evicted. And it makes you wonder, do these things have the same kind of implications for the future, depending on how people are getting evicted? So we're sort of looking into that now, thinking about different kinds of evictions and what implications they have for the future of the evictees. Let's go to the next page. Here we show, again, from the 2020 results, some evidence on credit experiences of people who've been evicted. And this is a little bit of a complicated chart, so let me take a moment with it. On the left side, the first set of columns you see are credit cards. And in the top bar chart, we see people who currently have a credit card. On the bottom, we see people who have recently applied for a credit card. In the blue bar are people who are evicted in the past and are currently renting. And you can see that people who are evicted in the past and are currently renting, the blue bar on the top chart, is quite a bit lower than the others. These are people who've been evicted in the past and are currently homeowners, other households who are currently renters, or other households who are currently homeowners. So what does that tell us? Well, if we compare it with the bottom chart, we see that people who are evicted in the past and are renters today, the blue bar on the bottom, those people are applying quite a lot for credit cards, but they're not getting them, as shown in the top. So that tells us that there's a shortage of credit access for people who have been evicted and are currently renters. Interestingly, about 35% of people who are evicted in our survey are actually currently homeowners, and they show up in the orange bars here. Those folks actually perform pretty much like everyone else, both in terms of credit cards and auto loans. And so you can sort of see that there's a substantial share. Most people who've been evicted in the past seem like they're facing difficulty getting the credit they need, but some of those folks actually look like they're getting access to credit in terms of the credit cards, in terms of auto loans, and in terms of home ownership. So that's an interesting dichotomy that also bears further research. Okay, next set of slides. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the expectations from our last survey, which was in 2022. Here we're pooling the results from 19, 20, and 22 to talk about how people expect their rents to change based on, first, their own household income on the left, and second, the neighborhood rents and where they live on the right-hand side. So on the left, you can see that people who actually have the lowest income are expecting the highest increase in rents in their neighborhoods. And that's sort of a monotonic relationship. The very lowest income have very high rent expectations of over 20%. Then we move down to the next highest income group, but still over 15%, about 15% for 50 to 100K, and then quite low, relatively speaking, increase expectations for high income respondents. On the right-hand side, it looks like, again, the first and second quintile, the lowest and the second lowest rent groups are the places where people are expecting the highest rent increases. And so this suggests that people are expecting rent burdens to increase quite a lot in 2022. They were expecting them over the subsequent year to increase quite a lot for low income respondents and in the lower income neighborhoods, low rent neighborhoods. And that's in fact what we saw. Next slide. I think this is my final slide. So one of the questions that we thought was really important to ask beginning in 2022, as so many eviction moratoria and other measures which were intended to help renters stay in their homes were expiring, was what people expected in terms of their own eviction chances over the coming year. And so there are two important kinds of results I think that we got here. One is that people's expectations that they will be evicted themselves over the coming year are not really strongly related to their expectations about rent increases in their own neighborhood or their expectations about how rent is going to increase relative to their income in their own personal situation. What is really a strong predictor of whether people think they will be evicted is whether they've had experience with eviction in the past. And here you can see that the blue dots show whether someone knew an evictee in the past, that question that we asked about knowing someone who's been evicted since 2006. People who know someone who's been evicted are 2.5 percentage points higher, more likely to say they might be evicted over the next year. And then the really big effect is whether they've been evicted themselves. That is, if you've been evicted yourself, it looks like something like a 12 percentage point higher probability that you think you will be evicted over the coming year, starting a year ago in February. That's a really strong and large effect. And it's consistent with people feeling like eviction is something of a cycle. Once one gets stuck into this cycle, it's always a present threat. And that is something that comes through very clearly in our survey. So this is sort of early days of our survey. We hope to continue to work on these questions and learn more about how people experience and expect eviction. Surveys in the field for 2023 right now, and we have many related questions and follow-ups to these previous questions. So I'll look forward to presenting those maybe a year from now. Thanks very much for inviting me, and I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining, Andrew. Really fascinating information and definitely very worrisome for all of us who work on housing stability issues. I do want to ask a question or a series of questions from Rosa, who is asking, who did you survey? How did you reach out to them? How did you make sure you were getting a diverse array of different participants to join you?
Yeah, this is a really great question. It's important that we try to get a very representative sample of households. And it's an online survey. It's a survey that's conducted for us by a vendor who runs a much larger panel survey where they ask a set of people questions about a variety of different subjects. We follow up with a smaller sample of those folks. So there's an extra effort to reach out to folks who may not have ready access to the internet because it's an internet survey. We have to try extra hard to get to oversample people who are less likely to answer an internet survey. And then we have to respect the fact that the final sample that we get isn't exactly representative. So we have to reweight it a little bit to make it more representative of the population as a whole. So it's a very complicated sampling frame and weighting scheme to get us to these final results, but we do feel like the final sample is pretty representative. But it's especially important, of course, in this kind of question where, an online survey asking people about their experience with eviction, if anything, you're probably going to get a little bit of an underrepresentation of people. That's why, whether we get exactly the right level of people reporting an experience themselves with eviction, that's part of the reason why we asked about whether folks know an evictee, because it's a little bit of a broader set of people who will know someone who's evicted as opposed to having been evicted themselves.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andrew. And, I was also struck by your chart that showed 50% of evictions happen for not issues beyond not paying rent. And, I think for me, at least, that really shines a light on the need for renter protections, because oftentimes it's this power imbalance between landlords and renters, and landlords are using that power that they have to evict people, even when it might not be for good cause or for good reason. Has the Federal Reserve Bank of New York taken any position on just cause eviction standards or other sorts of renter protections?
We are pretty careful about taking positions on political issues. And so as a nonpartisan agency, we have to be quite careful about things like that. However, we do think it's important to lay out the facts and allow policymakers to be aware of the kinds of things that are happening out there. So as you say, the large number of people who report being evicted for reasons other than their own income declining, things like the building was sold, or things like the owner of the building decided they wanted to move into the apartment. These are things that are, sort of speak for themselves in a sense. But again, we are a little cautious about saying, here's what we think the policymakers should do about these things.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining, Andrew. There's one question, I think, or two questions in the chat box. If you are able to get to them, we would love that. But I appreciate you sharing this information with us and look forward to you coming back in the future when you have the next version of your survey.
Thanks so much for having me. I'll take a look at the questions. Thanks again.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to move now onto our field updates. We're going to hear from Scott Gottgret, who's the Vice President of Housing and Senior Program Officer for the United Way of Central Maryland. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Scott.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you, Sarah and Kim, for organizing today's conversation into the National Low Income Housing Coalition for all that you do every day, but for this opportunity in particular. I'm here today representing not just United Way of Central Maryland, but also the Maryland Emergency Rental Assistance Coalition. We call it the MIRA Coalition for short, which is our local chapter of the National Low Income Housing Coalition's ERASE cohort. And we're working to make emergency rental assistance permanent and sustainable in Maryland in concert with other advocacy groups across the country working on similar efforts. Next slide. So I was asked to come today to share with you all how we came up with our need assessment, or our projection of unmet emergency rental assistance need for the state of Maryland. And I'll tell you that, until we put together an initial ask amount for how much outstanding need is out there, when we finally got the groups together to get this assessment and create a projection, it was like someone flipped a switch, and suddenly our movement gained traction, picked up some steam, got coverage in the press. And so it was really the original projection of need that got us going and got us started. And it's only kind of looking back that we see how far we've come and how significant that moment was for this nascent movement that we're building in Maryland. The Maryland Emergency Rental Assistance Coalition didn't exist before the National Low Income Housing Coalition's ERASE cohort. And so we owe a big debt of gratitude for those organizers. But I want to talk to you about why you would need a need projection, some of the key variables you'll look at, some of the key sources we've used. I'll demonstrate in this PowerPoint an actual walkthrough of the math, how we got to where we are, and then some tips and tricks for advocating with that data. Next slide. Great. So why should you get a need projection for outstanding demand for emergency rental assistance? First of all, it shows the severity of the crisis that's still facing renters. A lot of folks feel like the pandemic's already over. And just because we want it to be over doesn't mean that the ripple effects are not still with us. It also serves as a rallying cry for mobilizing the coalitions. When we started saying the federal emergency rental assistance is running out, the state is heading towards a cliff, we need to advocate for more. Almost the very first question that we were confronted with was like, well, how much are we talking about here? Every elected official or city council person or anyone we talked to, that was the starting point for discussion. We couldn't progress until we got past that moment. And so it was really essential for our success in getting other folks into the tent. It also helps drive decision-making for public policy, and it helps elected officials understand, what the stakes are and what the options are. And it's great for PR, including both the press and social media. We've gotten major coverage, headline coverage, front page coverage, and the press. And part of it is because we had that initial ask amount worked out. Next slide. So the key variables that we looked at from the beginning, and we got kind of an onion type situation going where we got some folks who were friendly with data and passionate about the issue together into a small group and sort of plan the constituent building blocks of what this projection would look like. And then we sort of brought more folks into the onion as we went along. And so it's useful to think about that. In your community, who are some key stakeholders who could get a handle on the numbers? And these were kind of the three variables we settled on. First, we needed to know how many households we were talking about, how many months of assistance we intended to provide to each household, and then the monthly rent amount. That may seem kind of easy on the outset, but we'll see how there's layers to those variables as well. And a key layer that we ran into almost immediately was the application rate. Just knowing how many unserved households are out there so far is not the same thing as knowing how many of them will actually apply if you make emergency rental assistance options available in the next fiscal year. So we had to cross that bridge, and we'll talk about that today. Next slide. The key sources we looked to, the first and by far, I think the industry standard for these conversations presently is the U.S. Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey. I put the URLs on this slide, so when this gets circulated, you can easily access them. But they're releasing new waves of data every month, and they're building up estimates based off of sample sizes, and so it's very precise, and it breaks down into your state. And you can further subdivide into your locality using some kind of math tricks. So if you want some help thinking how to get from the state to your local community, we can talk about that. I also use data from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the Out of Reach report, the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, and I put a link there to one article that deals with projection rates. Application rates. And then the National Equity Atlas has a tremendously useful rent debt dashboard that shows the overall burden of rent debt in the state, and then breaks it down by demographic groups like families with children or people of color to help folks understand who precisely is carrying the rent debt. Next slide. So the U.S. Census Bureau was really the main activity that we got our information from. And I just took a screenshot of their housing table. This is question 3B. I should note for you data nerds, the screenshots are of week 54, but the data I show how we got to our math is from week 53. And so there's not going to be an exact matchup, but I just wanted you all to see kind of what the spreadsheet looks like. So when you start looking at it, you're not completely overwhelmed. You'll see that the key thing is they ask folks, how likely are you to be evicted in the next 2 months? And so in this example, there's 21,503 people who are households who think they are very likely to be evicted, and then 34,645 there at the top who are somewhat likely. And then the best thing about this entire tool that the Census Bureau has made available is the crosstabs. So if you go to the next slide. So you can see I scrolled down to around row 78 or 79 in the spreadsheet. The cells at the top are automatically frozen for you. So you can see the crosstabs of how many of those 21,503 very likely to be evicted households, looking at rows 78 and 79, have children in them. And you'll see that now in February of 2023, the U.S. Census Bureau is projecting that 100% of all households who are facing imminent eviction are households with children in them. Now, our coalition is making a press release about this and driving that point home. But the point for today's conversation to take away is that there are crosstabs. You can see of those likely to be evicted, how many have children, what is their income bracket, have they applied for rental assistance? Now, these are our projections, but they're very useful projections. And we also, in addition to just taking a given month's data points, they're kind of point in time, we also look to the trends in this data, and that's helpful to kind of smooth over some of the fluctuations that you'll see in the census data from month to month. So looking at that trend line can be helpful too. Next slide. So the study that we found very useful also was this study from the Joint Center of Housing Studies at Harvard, where they basically broke down the application rate by income bracket. It turns out that the income bracket really determines how likely folks are to apply for rental assistance, with the lowest income renters being more likely to apply and higher income renters being less likely to apply. If you want to skip that step, that Harvard study also says that the kind of baseline for all incomes is 40%. So if you want to just take a shortcut to this entire effort, you can just assume that 40% of those with rent debt will apply. We took a more nuanced approach, and you'll see why in a minute. Next slide. So here, the first thing that we needed to do was to understand how many households would actually apply for assistance. We looked at two income brackets, those under 25,000, and then the income bracket 25 to 50K. And so again, from the Household Pulse Survey, we saw there were 11,761 households that were likely to be evicted. The application rate for that bracket was 45%. So then you end up with 5,292 that would likely apply for emergency rental assistance in the under 25,000 bracket. Then the next bracket, we looked at those in the 25K to 50K range, and there were 37,228 likely to be evicted. That application rate for that bracket is 40%. So then you end up with just shy of 15,000 applicants in the 25 to 50K range. And then you add the 25 to 50K bracket with the under 25 bracket. And that's where you get this right around 20,183 is the projected applicants we're dealing with for both of the income brackets that are under 50K. And that's a really important kind of baseline number to get your head around. In our advocacy push, we've said 20,000 is our number for the next fiscal year. That's how many households we think would apply for assistance, how many we're planning to try to serve. And now the question is, how much does it cost to serve those? Next slide. So we used fair market rent as our to help us identify how much a month of rent, a month of assistance would cost. Thankfully, the National Low Income Housing Coalition's Out of Reach report has those all in one place. Their drill down to the state level is incredibly useful. So this is a plug to check that out. We got a lot of our data, just the number of renters in the state, just helpful data points all in one place in that report. So incredibly useful for advocates. So we took the fair market rent for a 2-bedroom. We assumed that families would need a 2-bedroom. So then we look at the percentage of families that are among those that are behind on rent. We got 52%. Our ask sort of assumed 4 months of back rent and 1 month of forward rent, so 5 months of assistance. And then you multiply that together and you can get the ERA need for families, which is right at about 79 million in this case. Then we looked at non-family households and assumed 48% would be non-families. And an FMR for a 1-bedroom is $12,062. Again, 5 months of assistance, and we ended up with right at about $61 million of ERA need for non-families. When you merge families and non-families, you get right at about 140 million. And then we added both a 10% admin onto that, and then a 10% for self-sufficiency services to arrive at our final number, which is 175 million, is the amount that we asked the governor for to continue emergency rental assistance once the federal ERAP funds run out. Next slide. Now, we didn't stop there. We ran these calculations on the 35K and below bracket, the 50K and below bracket, and the 75K and below bracket. And then we also tinkered with the variable about the months for assistance and put it into this kind of grid so that policymakers could understand that they had a range of options. And also, we chose some options that are more expensive than our option and then that are less expensive for our option. So you can see that ours is kind of a moderate ask right in the middle of the pack. And policymakers could see what they would lose if they funded less or what they could do more if they added more money to the mix. The point of this move, though, is a rhetorical strategy to change the conversation from yes, $175 million, no, $175 million, from a yes, no decision, from an if conversation to a how much is the better amount to fund. And it's way easier to approach an elected official and say, here's the situation, here's the challenge, here's the need. And it's not an up or down, yes or no vote to 175 million. It's how much is appropriate to deal with the situation. And this turns the conversation from an if to a how conversation, or from a whether we're going to fund emergency rental assistance to a how much are we going to fund emergency rental assistance, or at least that's our hope, is that by phrasing it in this range, it's easier to make an intervention. We want to get at least some money out of the state, and that'll hopefully create a foundation for a lasting safety net for renters going forward. Next slide. So a few tips with this data is we recommend bringing additional stakeholders into the data conversation and vetting your projections with experts in your area. So for example, we took our numbers to the Maryland Center for Economic Policy, to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and a few other partners. We went through 3 separate iterations of the data and got stronger each time. But bringing in these stakeholders, your data are always just going to be projections, right? I mean, this isn't history. It's not science. We're really trying to kind of come up with a best guess of what's needed. And so your projections are always going to be kind of on shaky ground because it's uncharted territory. But if you can bring in other experts to help vet your analysis, it'll add that much more strength to your numbers. It's like we're not trying to get the perfect number. We're trying to get a starting point for discussion. And then if the partners kind of agree you're in the right ballpark, then you can start talking with policymakers about how to action that. We also talked about phrasing it as a range. You can see that same graph that was just presented on that slide in the context of our entire, what we call our 2-pager or our fact sheet, which sort of makes the entire case for emergency rental assistance for Maryland kind of all in one place. And that graph, that table of the different options is a real centerpiece of our advocacy collateral. We're also really emphasizing how much families are struggling right now. We're talking about it in terms of rent debt, lingering rent debt, not in terms of ongoing income disruptions from the pandemic. Most people seem to argue that unemployment is low, the economy has rebounded, and so every time we talk about ongoing pandemic woes or repeated income disruptions, people say the jobs are back. So now, though, we talk about it in terms of an outstanding rent debt issue, and we've gotten a lot more traction there. And we're also emphasizing the number of families who are likely to be evicted, because then it sets us up to talk about the trauma for children or educational disruptions. And, families with young children have been the hardest hit in the pandemic. And so that allows us to make that point. So I think that's the gist of it. So that's how we arrived at our ask, and I'll throw it open for questions.
Yeah, such great work. I know that this is going to be really an important model for folks on the call who are working in their communities to push for more emergency rental assistance funds. I loved that you were able to really highlight the impact on children and households with children. I'm wondering, has that opened up some political avenues for you as you're talking to your elected officials?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We I would say, half the time it feels like we're winning the struggle for more rental assistance, and then sometimes it feels like we've had some setbacks. But anytime we start insisting on that families are struggling right now, it really reframes the conversation. We bring in new allies. We can talk to educators. We can talk to a whole different subset of elected officials. It really has broken the stalemate in a lot of conversations and captured headlines and the hearts and minds of elected officials and the media also. So it's really gotten us a lot of mileage every time we emphasize families with children.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing this. We have to move on, but I'm hoping people are taking note of the strategy that you've been using, the calculations that you made, so that they can look at the same thing in their own communities. And of course, I just wanted to remind folks that we are advocating at the federal level as well for a permanent emergency rental assistance program. And I can see this information being incredibly helpful in terms of getting more co-sponsors onto those bills. So I want to just thank you so much for joining with us and giving us some new tools that we can be using.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now we're going to turn to our next field update. We're going to hear from Peter Tatian and Susan Jacob. I think I'm turning it over first to Peter.
Yes, that is correct. Hello, everyone. Great to be here today. We're going to be talking about an eviction prevention framework that was created collaboratively by the DC Eviction Prevention Co-Leaders Group. And we released a report on this framework this past month. So I'm very happy to present this to you today, along with one of the members of the Co-Leaders Group, Susan Jacob, from Housing Counseling Services. So can we see? Yep, there we go. Thank you so much. And so, as has already been discussed, as the moratoria and protections against eviction have been phased out, and as the large amount of federal emergency rental assistance has been spent, we're seeing rising eviction filings, judgments, writs, and scheduled evictions in DC, as I'm sure we're seeing in many other communities around the country. And they are not at pre-pandemic levels, which is good, and we hope that we can keep them that way. But nevertheless, the increase is still alarming for those working to prevent evictions. Next slide. So the DC Co-Leaders Group came together after the White House Summit on Evictions in June 2021. And this group was initially focused on making sure that federal emergency rental assistance got to tenants and landlords who needed it as quickly as possible. And actually, we were very successful. DC dispersed those funds faster than just about any other jurisdiction in the country. But then again, as those monies were spent, our attention turned to further steps to prevent evictions, focusing on a cross-sector collaborative approach. And so within the DC Co-Leaders Group, we have representatives from DC government agencies, the DC Superior Court, legal service providers, housing counselors, and local philanthropy. And so on the next slide, part of our framework really gets into a little bit of detail about the eviction process in DC. And we're implementing interventions at many points in this process, such as making sure that people have access to legal representation and advice, but also having housing counselors available during court hearings. But as Susan will talk about, we are also looking at ways to intervene before people even get into the eviction process. So in the next slide, you'll see the main action areas within the eviction prevention framework. So we go into some detail within each of these areas about things that the group is doing currently around improving outreach to tenants, making sure people have access to emergency financial resources, and other kinds of housing supports, eviction defense, and so on. But also describes the areas where we think we can strengthen these protections. So I'm going to now turn it over to Susan, who'll talk a little bit more in concrete terms about some of the things that housing counselors have been doing during this period to try to prevent evictions.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much. Just a little bit about HCS. We've been around in the Washington, D.C. area since 1972. So we have over 50 years of experience working within D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. And so just some of the outcomes that came from this collaboration, HCS staff were actually present in court hearings as housing counselors to provide information on current financial assistance applications, to provide tenants who are seeking assistance on how to apply. So far, we've attended over 3,000 hearings to date virtually, and we have plans for when court does go back into session in person to have staff be there for that as well. We also have extensive collaboration amongst our partners to make what we call last mile payments. These are where we were trying to bridge the gap that was happening with what we called State EC, which was where the federal funding was going, and then our local funds. We have local emergency rental assistance program funds, but there was a gap between what the original program might have paid, the federal program versus the local program. So we tried to bridge the gap with that, because in DC, every penny has to be paid before an eviction can actually be canceled. For those last mile payments, even to date today, we've made over $2 million in those payments from Housing Counseling Services with our local funds, and we've assisted over 250 households who have already previously received rental assistance from the federal program. We, in FY22, which we stopped over 70% of the scheduled evictions for the ones that were due to non-payment of rent. And we also realized that housing case management is vital in assisting tenants in reaching housing stability. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of our in-house housing counseling program, which we call RISE. This is a sample of 150 clients who went through that program, 150 residents of the district. And just some interesting numbers that we thought were great was if someone applied for our local program, but they owed more than the program maximum allowable amount, we tried to refer them to this program to allow our counselors to assist the tenant with potentially negotiating some forgiveness or some payment plans, or an affordable payment plan, so that the gap can be bridged and they could still receive the ERAP assistance. And so we were able, out of the 150, we were able to resolve the gap for 50 of those tenants who applied. I mean, that was 33% of that total 150. So just to give you an example of why we also believe the collaboration with housing providers is also very important, and for housing counselors to work together with housing providers to try to alleviate the eviction process, and also allow the housing provider to receive some funds, because we know that that was a big problem during the pandemic, and that even though there were tenants who were at risk of losing their housing, there were also housing providers that were counting on funds in order to potentially maintain their buildings, maintain mortgages, things like that. So I just wanted to provide this as a snapshot of what our in-house housing counseling program has been doing. Next slide, please. So some of our other collaborative efforts, and as Peter mentioned, what we do is we try to go out into the community and do what we call pop-ups, where we go to different buildings where they may have high rates of delinquency. We're kind of looking for over 17%. We did these very successfully when we had the money from the federal program, where we were able to go to many buildings. We assisted over 700 tenants apply for assistance, and help them communicate with their housing provider if the relationship wasn't good. And we now have funding to start that up again. So we are hoping to start this up very soon. And it allows us to also have really good communication with housing providers as to what is out there for financial assistance, which leads me to my second point, in that we try to do trainings with housing providers, with legal service providers, and other partners within our continuum so that we can always keep people abreast of the financial assistance programs that are available. And we also, as an organization, continue to attend working groups where we can in real time problem solve and discuss some of the things that we may need to change in our process. These collaborative efforts have allowed us to stop evictions within 24 hours, within the same day, just by having these this open communication and open line of communication. And I think the next slide is back to Peter.
Great, thank you, Susan. And so I just wanted to wrap things up by acknowledging, as we do in the framework, that there's an underlying challenge, of course, with eviction prevention, which is that housing costs are just too high for many people in DC. And although the co-leads group specifically isn't focused on solving this overall housing affordability problem, many of our members are actively working in other capacities to solve housing problems more broadly. And we want to use the co-leaders group to continue to elevate those challenges and possible solutions. So I know we only had a short time today, and so there's a tremendous amount in the framework. And so we have a link to the framework report on the final slide here. So I hope that you all will be able to take some time to take a look at it, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have about it. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box, but I just want to say I'm struck by how successful your efforts have been. Really incredible work on the ground here in DC, and just want to thank you so much for sharing all this information with us. Hope people check it out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. So now I'm going to give our Capitol Hill update, the last update of the day. The thing that I want folks to have most in mind is that we're starting to see the fights over the budget start to gear up. I think it's going to really kick off in earnest on March 9th when the president releases his budget request for the year. I think you're going to see a lot more conversation starting after that about how much should be funded for affordable housing, or maybe how much should be cut. As you know, we've talked about on past calls, House Republicans are pushing for very deep spending cuts to housing programs and other programs in exchange for lifting the debt ceiling or keeping the government open in FY24. President Biden and Speaker McCarthy met one time to talk about the issue, but they haven't been meeting since. We have not seen any formal negotiations taking place, but pressure is starting to build. And we have a lot of work ahead of us to make sure that we're talking to every senator and representative about why these cuts to housing investments would be so harmful, especially now as communities are seeing higher rents, more families are struggling to pay rent, eviction filings are up, and homelessness is increasing in many places. So just a quick word about what we know Republicans are pushing for. There's a lot of details that we don't know just yet, but we do know that most Republicans are calling for capping funding for FY24 at FY22 spending levels. If you do that, that would be about a $130 billion cut to programs, or about a 9% cut to discretionary spending. But it doesn't mean that all cuts are going to be evenly played out. We've also heard Republicans say that they don't want to cut any money from defense spending or from Medicare or Social Security, which basically, or veterans health, which means that all of the cuts are going to have to come from other domestic programs like housing programs. And if that's the case, we could see cuts as high as 24%. It's really the most significant legislative threat that we are facing this year is around the budget. So just a quick word on what you can be doing right now. In the chat box, I'd love for my colleagues to share a link to our annual budget letter, which is a letter that's led by many national organizations that are part of the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding. And in our letter, we encourage the highest level of funding possible for housing programs and homelessness programs, And we urge Congress to push back on any attempts to cut funding for those programs. So that's one place where you can have an immediate action. I'm going to put it in the chat box here. We'll also share it with you in our follow-up email after today's call. The other thing that you could be doing is talking to your Republicans and Democrats about what these housing cuts mean. It's really important that we're not leaving any members of Congress off the table. Even if you have a very conservative member of Congress, it's still really helpful for them to hear about why these cuts would impact their own community. And for that, we've created a new toolkit that you can use to oppose those dramatic cuts in spending. It includes talking points, sample media messages, sample op-eds, and other tools that you could be using in your community. And finally, I just wanted to mention, if you haven't done it already, you can register for our annual forum, which is our national conference later in March. And you can sign up for our Capitol Hill Day so that you can join with other advocates from your state as they go and make their meetings on the Hill. It's a great opportunity, especially if you've never done Hill meetings before. Maybe you're a little nervous, maybe you're a little apprehensive. This is a place where you can do it with other advocates, and it's really inspiring to see so many great folks in one room who are doing that work. So encourage you guys to to sign up for our Hill Day. If you're interested, you may also sign up for our prep webinar, which is tomorrow at 4 o'clock, where we're going to go over all of the most important talking points that you need to know, what you can expect on Hill Day, and how you can incorporate storytelling into your policy asks so that we're making sure we're really centering the work that we're all doing around people who have lived experience and their needs. So with that, I am going to end today's national call. I want to thank everybody for joining with us, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.